November 22nd, 1963. Dealey Plaza, Dallas, Texas. President John F. Kennedy was riding in a presidential motorcade with his wife Jackie, the governor of Texas, John Connally, and John Connally's wife when JFK would be shot. The shooter, Lee Harvey Oswald, would take the shot from the Texas School Book Depository building and proceed to make a speedy getaway, but was later shot 2 days later on live television. The JFK assassination played a pivotal role in American history and changed the political landscape of the United States forever. Although what people don't know is that John F. Kennedy would be just a strand of the web of strange deaths, murders, and accidents that would befall the Kennedy family since the beginning of their inception. Some might say this strange web of deaths is mere coincidence, but some call it a curse. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we pull back the curtain and dive deep into a political and societal mystery, one in which that is perplexing and as mysterious as it sounds. Is there any correlation to the deaths of the numerous members of the Kennedy family over the past 80 years, or even the other injuries and accidents that seem like no accident? Today, we untangle the conspiracy of the Kennedy curse. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. I am your host, Dominic, and today's episode is a very special one, and that is because it is episode 50. So before we dive into all of the regular stuff that I usually show you on episodes in regards to our stories and everything like that, I want to say a big thank you for you all for supporting me. Obviously, episode 50 is a big deal. I've celebrated little milestones before in the past, but this one feels extra special. Being able to get to 50, it's a big deal, and I hope to continue putting out this content. And again, I just appreciate all of the support and everything like that I've received over this past year. It's been quite the adventure, quite the experience, and obviously I've said it before that this podcast takes up quite a considerable amount of my free time, and I wouldn't have it any other way, to be honest with you, and I thoroughly enjoy making it. And here's to 50 more, and then probably 50 after that. Again, I just want to thank you all for the support. So for the topic today, it is a very loaded one, and I am very, very, very excited for it. Of course, someone like myself who's very passionate about history, I find this topic intriguing in a variety of ways. Now, today's story has drama, true crime, unsolved questions, and even a touch of the supernatural if you want to think of it that way. Of course, this week's episode will obviously most likely have brief mentions of politics throughout it. And because of that, I do want to give a disclaimer warning, only because I do not willingly talk about politics on the show. I am merely a facts-based person. I am not here to cast my opinion on political drama, nor do I talk about politics on a normal basis anyway. I don't like talking about it on my podcast. I try to give you all the facts that I possibly can, political opinions aside, but obviously anybody who knows the Kennedy family, their impact in politics is immense. So there will be a lot of mention of politics throughout this episode, so I do just want to let you all know. But of course, I'm here to give you the facts, and nothing but the facts, and what I was able to find in my research. Now, what inspired me to do this topic for this week's episode? And that could be answered a couple of different ways. Firstly, we have seen a resurgence in talk around Robert Kennedy Jr., who was in the news for his campaign for president, and the most recent endorsement he had of former President Trump. And to be honest, it kind of got me thinking about the JFK assassination and even the assassination of his father, Robert Kennedy Sr., and it kind of led me down this rabbit hole of strange deaths that the Kennedy family has really had since the 1940s, and even strange accidents and near-death experiences that the family has had as well that make anyone really scratch their heads about. And before I share every little detail, it is a lot. And it definitely, on the surface to me, doesn't seem like a coincidence, but I will leave that all up to you to decide for yourselves. So how today's episode is going to go is that we are going to get into the strange accidents, incidents, and deaths of members of the Kennedy family and some background on those particular incidents, as well as the controversy surrounding quite a few of them, and then go into some more details I uncovered in my research, and then discuss possible theories about the Kennedy curse, and whether or not I think it is a real thing that should be talked about more, or maybe even whether or not the CIA has killed the whole family. Who knows? And maybe I'm just playing, or am I? But before we dive into the series of events that have unfolded to the Kennedy family over the past 80 years, let's talk about who they were as people. For the most part, the Kennedys are one of the most popular and well-known political families that the United States has ever seen, with members of the family holding various political rankings such as Attorney General, multiple state senators, and of course JFK actually obtaining the presidency, and many, many more. The list goes on and on and on. Of course, on the surface, many people know of the JFK assassination, and possibly even the assassination of JFK's brother Robert Kennedy, like I mentioned before, but the family has seen a swath of deaths and strange happenings to pretty much anyone with the last name Kennedy. So let's start it off with a brief history lesson on the Kennedy family and a lot of the names that we are going to hear today throughout this episode. Now, the patriarch of the Kennedy family during the early 1900s would be Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., now Joseph Sr., from a very early age, started venturing into entrepreneurship and eventually into banking, and at the age of 25, he would become one of the youngest bank presidents in the country. Joseph's business ventures eventually led him to Hollywood in the film industry, and he made connections that would go on to get him into politics and also be able to get him very wealthy in the process. Joseph Sr. would go on to father 9 children: Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, Edward, Ted Kennedy, Kathleen Kennedy, Eunice Kennedy, Rosemary Kennedy, Patricia Kennedy, and Jean Kennedy. Now, why do I mention Joe Sr.? That is because you're going to hear a lot of those names again and again, and I wanted to kind of set that up for the rest of the story. And the first one of these names we're going to talk about again is Joseph Jr. Now, Joseph Kennedy Jr. would be the first victim of the so-called Kennedy curse when he was fighting for the United States in World War II. He was an officer in the U.S. Navy and had volunteered for Operation Aphrodite, which was a secret bombing run being conducted in Normandy, France, to take out a German target. On August 12, 1944, he and another soldier, Lieutenant Wilford Willey, were going to be riding in a radio-controlled B-17 bomber armed with the explosives stored on board, and then they were going to trigger these explosives manually and then eject from the aircraft to safety. However, 2 minutes after giving the code to the radio operators that the plane was ready for the bombing run, the plane spontaneously exploded early, killing Joseph Jr. and Wilford Willey. Now, this would be the very first instance of a Kennedy passing away. However, there are other little strange incidents that happened to the family as well over the years, of course, that I will touch on at the very end. But let's get back into the deaths in particular and kind of like the very notable events that happened. Now, obviously, Joseph Jr. would be killed instantly, and the death of Joseph Jr. would devastate the family. And during the time of Joe Jr.'s passing, JFK himself was actually recovering from being injured in World War II. And again, his family was hit extremely, extremely hard by the loss. Since it was so unexpected, it was so tragic. And again, it just was not something that they were expecting, because Joseph Jr., again, was just so young. They just were not expecting this. But it wouldn't take long until another member of the Kennedy family would meet an unfortunate fate. Just 4 years later, another death would hit the family. Now, the next death would happen, again, like I said, just a mere 4 days later in 1948, and it would be one of the daughters, Kathleen, who went by Kick Kennedy. Now, before we talk about her death, let's give her a little background about her personal life, because it kind of pertains to how she dies. When Joseph Kennedy Sr. was actually the UN ambassador to Great Britain, he would often take his wife Rose and Kick to England, and many people within the English social circles and kind of royalty had not really met anyone quite like Kick at this point, because Kick was such a outgoing person, and she never really took herself too seriously, and that's kind of the way she lived life. And, of course, this gained the attention of a lot of British royalty, British socialites, and eventually she caught the eye of Billy Hartington, future Duke of Devonshire, and they formed a relationship. However, religious views would drive a wedge in their relationship, as Billy was Protestant and the Kennedy family was Catholic. Eventually, Billy and Kick decided to get married and said that he wanted their future children to be raised Protestant, which angered Joe Sr. and Rose. In 1944, shortly after D-Day, Billy would be killed in World War II, leaving Kick widowed after only 4 months of marriage. 2 years later, she would then start an affair with a married man and Earl, Peter Wentworth Fitzwilliam. Peter was extremely wealthy and often took that out through drinking and gambling. Now, during this affair, Peter told Kik that he was willing to leave his wife for her and start a new relationship. Peter was also Protestant, and Mama Rose Kennedy was pissed and threatened to disown Kik if she married another Protestant English lord. So in 1948, as an appeal to Joe Sr., who was actually in country at the time, Peter and Kik boarded an airplane and wrote to Cannes, France, to appeal to Joe Sr. about them getting back together. However, turbulence was an issue on the flight, and the pilot warned against them taking off, but Peter insisted that they leave. The plane refueled in Paris, but would never make it to Cannes, and the plane crashed, killing Kik, Peter, and the pilot. Now, this would be the second Kennedy family member to die within a 4-year time frame, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. Now, 2 children of John F. Kennedy would actually pass away later on in the 1900s, with him losing his daughter Arabella at birth in 1956, and then Patrick in 1963, who would pass away 2 days after being born premature. Now, of course, we go through kind of a dead period, with the next Kennedy death being the big one on November 22nd, 1963. Of course, John F. Kennedy, then President of the United States, would be killed while riding in a convertible with his wife Jackie, the governor of Texas, and the governor of Texas's wife in Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. Now, anybody who has done any maybe high school level world history class or even U.S. history class, everyone should have a basic understanding in the implications that JFK's assassination had on American politics, and still kind of does, and the overall mystery that is still surrounding it to this day. Lee Harvey Oswald, the JFK assassin, had a crazy life story that many people don't know about, including his fascination with socialism, and stating to members of his military unit when he was stationed in Atsugi, Japan, that normal tasks assigned to them from higher-ups in command would not be applicable under Karl Marx, and that this was the capitalist government's doing. Now, before you say anything about this and you think that I'm casting a political opinion here, these are genuine facts about Lee Harvey Oswald. This is not me casting an opinion. This is not me saying that, he's making up that Lee Harvey Oswald was a socialist. He was a socialist. Those are facts. You can Google them up. These are facts. He actually talked about this. This is facts. And Lee Harvey Oswald had actually tried to assassinate someone before JFK, and not a lot of people know about this, in which he tried to assassinate U.S. Army General Edwin Walker, in which Lee Harvey Oswald actually missed his shot when he fired into Walker's home. Now, the ammo Lee Harvey Oswald used would be traced back to his rifle he used and purchased when he arrived back in the United States in 1962, after his brief military service, and then obviously he ended up taking a trip to Russia before he went back to the United States to try and earn Russian citizenship. And when he arrived in Russia, he declared himself a communist, and that's kind of why he wanted to earn Russian citizenship. Now, eventually, like I said, Lee Harvey Oswald would make his way back to the United States, and once he did, he adopted a new identity of Alec J. Heidel, which, if you got to think about that name, Alec J. Heidel, the last name Heidel obviously bears a striking resemblance to the first name of Cuban dictator Fidel Castro, and Lee Harvey Oswald's wife had actually called him out on this, and he told her to, quote-unquote, shut up. So obviously, cat's out of the bag there. Oswald had mixed feelings about JFK. However, with the good came the bad. Originally, he kind of liked some of JFK's policies and everything like that, but he hated JFK's handling of the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. Again, Oswald was a communist, so this kind of makes sense. When JFK kind of handled the whole Cuba situation not very well, this would probably make Oswald hate him. He hated the Bay of Pigs handling that whole situation, and I think many people who you talk to about U.S. history obviously say that the Bay of Pigs invasion was extremely botched, and that was just a failure on multiple fronts. But Lee Harvey Oswald also then really just hated capitalism, and to be honest, thought of killing JFK as basically a message, and sending a message to the government, and basically sticking it to the man, sort of speak. However, 2 days later, after being caught and arrested for the murder of JFK, Lee Harvey Oswald would then be killed on November 24th by a nightclub owner named Jack Ruby, and he actually did this when cameras were rolling and covering Oswald's escort from the jail. Now, Jack Ruby's supposed motive for killing Oswald was that he wanted to spare Jackie Kennedy from having to go through the trauma of having to testify, but on the surface, this doesn't make any sense, as Lee Harvey Oswald would have the only information as to why he committed the crime. And after Jack Ruby killed Oswald, people quickly rushed to the idea that Jack Ruby was a part of this greater conspiracy with Lee Harvey Oswald, or perhaps some higher power, to keep Oswald from talking to authorities and basically the greater American public. Now, Jack Ruby has also been associated with having some low-level dealings with organized crime, which the Warren Commission, which if you don't know what the Warren Commission is, it was the investigative body formed by the U.S. government to investigate the JFK assassination. They couldn't find any significant connections between Jack Ruby and organized crime, although there is some evidence to show that he did have some, again, like I said, low-level dealings with organized crime, but ultimately the Warren Commission's like, there's nothing to really tie him. We're not going to say he was a part of this. However, I could do a whole episode on the JFK assassination, and I probably will at some point, but I wanted to give you that kind of little backstory and kind of recap and kind of the possible conspiracies at play within the JFK assassination, but also the greater topic that is today's episode with the Kennedy curse. Now, of course, back on track and back on topic here, the deaths associated with the Kennedy family would not stop, as they're 5 years later, on June 5th, 1968, Robert Kennedy would be assassinated while on the campaign trail for his bid for the presidency. Now, Robert Kennedy had built another substantial political career in the Senate and briefly served as Attorney General. Bobby, as he was often called, criticized the current president from his own party, Lyndon B. Johnson, on his handling of civil rights, the Vietnam War, and poverty in America. Now, Bobby wasn't nearly as charismatic as JFK was, but eventually he started to carve out a pretty good presidential campaign for himself. Now, unfortunately, while campaigning at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, awaiting results from the Democratic primary, Bobby Kennedy would be shot multiple times from point-blank range with a .22 caliber revolver by a man named Sirhan Sirhan. Now, Sirhan Sirhan was a Palestinian Jordanian immigrant who hated Bobby Kennedy's pro-Israel stance. Bobby Kennedy would be rushed to the hospital, where he would pass away the following day on June 6th. Now, of course, you have these two assassinations take place in very close proximity with each other, obviously 5 years apart. But it kind of goes to show you, again, kind of the target the Kennedy family had on their back in the world of politics. You know, they had already, up to this point, this is the 60s, the Kennedy family is already pretty well established, and we've already seen numerous members of the Kennedy family die under maybe strange or coincidental circumstances, but it doesn't stop there. Now, fast forward to the following year of 1969, Ted Kennedy, who was obviously the brother of Robert and JFK, was then also a U.S. Senator representing the state of Massachusetts, and he was attending a party on Chappaquiddick Island off the coast of Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. Now, just a little context to Ted Kennedy during this time. Of course, we know that both JFK and Bobby Kennedy, before they were both assassinated, had very successful political careers, and, of course, they had both passed away at this point. Now, this had hit Ted very hard, and it was very difficult for Ted to kind of process the losses of his brothers, and it was very difficult for him to handle, and he took a lot of the stress from his brothers' passings on his own shoulders, and he took that and he tried to live up to the unspoken expectations that his brothers kind of left behind. Now, obviously, you are the brother of both RFK and JFK. The expectations on your shoulders to kind of maybe follow in their footsteps is immense. So he had a very difficult time handling this basically unexpected stress that he didn't expect he was going to have. Now, on July 18th, 1969, while attending this party on Chappaquiddick Island, Ted left around midnight to take another guest from the party, 28-year-old Mary Jo Kopechne, back to the ferry. However, Kopechne would not make it back to the ferry, as while en route to the ferry, Ted's car would actually drive off a bridge and into a tidal creek. Now, Ted was able to get himself out of the rapidly sinking car, but Kopechne was not able to, and she would end up drowning. The main controversy surrounding this is that afterwards, Ted, even though he did try and save Mary Jo Kopechne, he did not report the accident and the drowning until 10 hours after the incident, lending people to believe that he put his political image before the life of a woman. Of course, that would not make for a very good newspaper headline. Ted Kennedy would receive a 2-month suspended sentence for leaving the scene of an accident, and his license would be suspended for a year. In 1970, a grand jury declined to indict him further. Now, this wouldn't be Ted Kennedy's only possible run-in with death, as in 1964, just a year after JFK's assassination, Ted Kennedy would survive a plane crash in Southampton, Massachusetts that would claim the life of a fellow U.S. senator, an aide in the plane, and also the pilot. Now, Ted Kennedy was in bad shape, but he would of course live from his injuries, and what furthered the curse rumors, and that the idea that a curse exists in some capacity, was Bobby Kennedy remarking to a political aide that night of Ted's plane accident, and I quote, "Someone up there doesn't like us." Now, Ted Kennedy felt similarly about the possibility of a Kennedy family curse after the death of Mary Jo Kopechne, and this kind of whole crash with Ted Kennedy, and that would take place in 1969, would later become known as the Chappaquiddick incident. And like I said, Ted Kennedy felt very similarly that there was a curse and that there was somebody that did not like them, and he was very vocal about this after the Chappaquiddick incident. Fast forward again, you take another time jump, this time to 1984. This is when the next death of the Kennedy family would happen, when the fourth child of Bobby Kennedy and his wife, Ethel Skackel, would be found dead from overdose. Now, after an autopsy, it was determined that the cause of death to David Kennedy, who was the fourth child, that the cause of death to David Kennedy was overdose from a combination of cocaine and prescription drugs. Now, it turns out that David Kennedy had actually turned to using these drugs very prolifically after the assassination of his dad, Bobby. Again, this kind of goes back to the idea of the pressure Ted was facing after both of his brothers were assassinated as well. Of course, David would actually see his dad's assassination pretty much on live TV practically. So again, you can only imagine the weight and the strain that this takes on somebody's, obviously, their mental and physical health, because David venturing into the world of cocaine and prescription drugs and abusing them, and also his mental state must have been rapidly declining to get him to this point. And obviously seeing your father assassinated practically on live TV is not something I expect anybody would deal great with, or even anything along those lines. And I have to imagine it was a very, very difficult time for David, and obviously he would be the next victim of the Kennedy curse in 1984. Now we're going to take another time jump. This time, the next death of the Kennedy family would be in 1997, and it would be another one of Bobby Kennedy's children, this time Michael Kennedy. On New Year's Eve, 1997, while skiing in Aspen, Colorado, Michael would have a fatal skiing accident while partaking in an activity that many members of the Kennedy family had done in previous years, and that being playing football while skiing. Now, when I originally did my research and I saw playing football while skiing, I wanted to kind of figure out what that fully entailed and why that sounded extremely dangerous, but also extremely fun. And it kind of teeters on the edge of both of those. Again, on the surface, that might not be something that you partake in skiing, but it seems to me that the Kennedy family did this quite frequently, and this was just kind of a normal activity, which I had not heard of until I had done research into this. Now, while throwing this small rubber football back and forth with relatives, Michael would lose control of one of his skis, which would send him careening into a tree. Which, I mean, again, I'm not laughing because of the circumstance, because it's horrible, but you got to talk about terrible luck. Terrible, terrible luck, all things considered. Now, Michael was reportedly a tremendous skier, with an acquaintance of the family saying, and I quote, "But it's not like he was skiing recklessly. Michael is the best skier. A tremendously gifted athlete who could ski downhill backwards and blindfolded," close quote. I don't know if he's just making an analogy here or if he can genuinely do that. If Michael Kennedy could genuinely ski downhill backwards and blindfolded, that is very impressive. But again, this kind of further perpetuates the idea that the Kennedy family might in fact be cursed. And there just isn't any other way to frame it other than that, considering Michael Kennedy was doing something that he probably did very frequently, and he just happened to, again, hit a case of bad luck and tragically pass away. Now, 2 years later, another Kennedy would die, and this time it would be John F. Kennedy Jr. On July 16th, 1999, at around 8:38 p.m., an airplane piloted by JFK Jr., containing him, his wife, Carolyn Bessette, and sister-in-law, Lauren Bessette, originally left Essex Township, New Jersey, and was last seen on radar approximately 17 miles from Martha's Vineyard when the plane would suddenly disappear. No emergency declaration would be made from the plane, and a search was launched, and 5 days later the plane and bodies of the 3 occupants were found inside around 10 miles off the coastline. The National Traffic Safety Bureau blamed the accident on, and I quote, "the pilot's failure to maintain control of the airplane during a descent over water at night, which was the result of spatial disorientation. Factors in the accident were haze and the dark night." Close quote. Now, at this point, I don't think any Kennedy should fly in an airplane just due to sheer coincidence after coincidence after coincidence, if you even want to call it that. Now, on the surface, the death of John F. K. Jr. seems very suspicious, and it just seems, again, like a one-off coincidental fluke. This is what these kind of seem like they are at this point, are one-off coincidental flukes. But, again, it kind of makes you wonder, like, there's got to be something going on, because the Kennedys are just doing activities they would normally do, and they are just passing away after tragic accident after tragic accident after tragic accident. And the next unexpected Kennedy death would come in the shape of Ted Kennedy's daughter in 2011. Now, Kara Kennedy, in 2011, she would pass away suddenly from a heart attack while working out in a gym in Washington, D.C. Now, of course, this would actually be 2 years after her father, Ted Kennedy, would actually pass away at the age of 77 due to brain cancer. Now, the only reason I don't mention Ted Kennedy dying is that in the grand scheme of things, this is kind of a realistic death. Ted Kennedy lived to the age of 77, and he was actually the only son of Joseph Sr. to live into old age, so his passing is not usually attributed to the Kennedy curse. However, back to Kara. Kara actually carved out a respectable career for herself actually in Hollywood, and she became a very respected film producer, and she actually lived an extremely private life, and there obviously were members of the Kennedy family that lived very private, kind of away from the rest of them. They didn't want to be in the political spotlight. They didn't want to, draw any unnecessary attention to themselves, and Kara was one of those people. She lived her life, like I said, extremely private, even probably the most private out of any other members of her family up to this point, and any of her family had done in years prior. And of course, she would die suddenly from a heart attack, which again, very one-off fluke. She's working out of the gym, has a heart attack, dies. Like, it is just, at this point, again, one-off coincidental flukes seem to be the consistent theme here. And it's just really tough to explain. If you're approaching this from a factual perspective, it's just really, really difficult to explain. Now, just a few months later, on May 16th, 2012, Mary Richardson Kennedy, the former wife of RFK Jr. at the time, they were going through custody and legal battles at this time, and they were actually getting a divorce, so they were technically split up at this point. Mary Richardson Kennedy would actually be found dead in her home in Bedford, New York, from suicide. Now, you can jump forward again. We'll take another time jump, this time to 2018. Christopher Lawford, who was the son of Peter Lawford and Patricia Kennedy, is found dead by heart attack at the age of 63 in Vancouver, British Columbia. Now, different sources I checked had him listed as a victim of the Kennedy curse, and other ones they didn't list him. And I'm kind of assuming, given his age here, being 63, and the fact that it seemed to be kind of a natural death rather than, kind of like an unexpected or mysterious one, or kind of maybe the idea that he didn't have the Kennedy surname is the reason that he's not mentioned in some sources as a victim of the Kennedy curse. I'm not really sure, but I felt like he still should be mentioned in here as well, in terms of when we're listing everybody out who had passed away. Now, in 2019, another death. This time it would be RFK's granddaughter, Saoirse Kennedy Hill. Now, she would be found dead due to an accidental overdose at the Kennedy family compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. Saoirse was vocal about her on and off bouts with depression and wrote in her school's newspaper at Deerfield Academy, and I quote, "My depression took root in the beginning of my middle school years and will be with me for the rest of my life. Although I was a mostly happy child, I suffered bouts of deep sadness that felt like a heavy boulder on my chest." Close quote. Now, the toxicology reports of Saoirse reports they showed acute methadone. These are, okay, I'm going to try and pronounce some of these words, but I might butcher them, so please bear with me, and I do apologize. The toxicology report showed acute methadone, diazepam, nordadiazepam, fluoxetine, norfluoxetine, and ethanol toxicity were all in her system at the time of her death. And again, I have to assume that that is an extremely crazy cocktail of different substances. And after doing a quick Google search, it seems like she was on drugs such as Valium, Prozac, anxiety medications, methadone, which is of course used to treat heroin dependency, and then you kind of couple that with copious amounts of alcohol. It is just not shaping up for a very good outcome. Again, this is what I found with these chemicals in them, and this isn't necessarily what she took. So I do want to just clarify that info. I know when I say words, drugs such as Valium, Prozac, you probably understand what I'm talking about, rather than kind of the chemical compounds that are contained in each one of those drugs, if that makes any sense. And that info was done through my own research. Again, I'm not saying that she took Valium, Prozac, or all this other stuff. That, after Googling these chemical compounds, that is what came up. So that is why I'm reporting them for you. Just to clarify, I didn't want anybody coming after me. That being relatively recently, I don't want anybody coming after me and saying, hey, you reported on the wrong things. I'm just saying that's what I found in my own research. Now, lastly, the last victim, up to this point so far, of the so-called Kennedy curse was in 2020 when another one of RFK's granddaughters, Maeve Kennedy Townsend McKean, went missing with her young son Gideon after a canoeing trip in Chesapeake Bay on April 2nd of that year. They were visiting Maeve's mother's house when Maeve and Gideon had decided to climb into a nearby canoe to retrieve a ball that had fallen in the ocean water nearby. Now, when out in the ocean, Maryland authorities said that due to the extremely high winds, they were not able to get the canoe back into shore and actually capsized and would end up drowning. Now, that would be all of the deaths that are associated with the Kennedy curse. But those aren't the only things that have happened to the Kennedy family that might seem odd, coincidental, or even just bizarre. And because of that, I want to share these couple more additional kind of factoids, if you will, of information with you. Now, let's throw it back all the way to 1941. Rosemary Kennedy, who was the eldest of the Kennedy daughters from Joseph Sr., she had suffered from a lack of oxygen at birth, and this actually caused her to be developmentally slower than basically everybody else. Now, growing up, Rosemary was ensured by her family that extra time would be taken to make sure that she was receiving the same education as everyone else as she grew up, even though she was developmentally slower. She was processing that information much slower. It took her a heck of a lot more longer time to process information, and that's just kind of how she lived originally. And as Rosemary would hit her 20s, she would actually start to have violent mood swings and changes of behavior. And this caused Joseph Sr. to make a decision that he thought was best for her long-term health by having her undergo a new medical procedure called a lobotomy. Now, if you know where this is going by now, the surgery ended up getting botched badly, leaving Rosemary with the educational capacity of a 2-year-old and causing her to be unable to walk and even speak. Now, because of this, Rosemary would end up spending a majority of her life in and out of assisted living centers and basically hidden from the world, as if the world, if the world had happened to find out about Rosemary and her botched surgery, the Kennedy patriarch thought it could have been, it could have had damaging consequences and damaging ramifications to their political careers, which, from all the sources I found, that seemed to be Joseph Sr.'s mindset, is that if they found out about the botched lobotomy and that he kind of co-signed on it and now is kind of treating his daughter like a social outcast from the family, that's kind of fucked, for lack of a better term, and kind of changes some of my opinions a little bit about whether or not, you don't have to ask my opinion about politics. I think both sides are guilty, but again, that whole situation really kind of fucked, kind of just weird about this whole botched lobotomy thing, and it kind of takes place even before Joe Jr. dies, which I don't know if that kind of started the curse. Maybe Joe Sr. deciding to take, the idea of this very new medical procedure and do it, and then it obviously failing. Maybe that started the curse. Who knows? But it's kind of interesting to think about. Now, there would also be, again, 2 more car accidents that would happen to the Kennedy family as well, with one having taken place on August 13th, 1973, where Joseph P. Kennedy II, son of RFK, was driving a Jeep in Nantucket and crashed, leaving his brother David Kennedy and the other passenger, Pam Kelly, seriously injured. Pam Kelly was seriously injured, and this would actually cause her to become paralyzed. Obviously, David Kennedy would be injured in the crash as well, but this would be kind of, again, another car crash. To me, it seems like the Kennedys should stay out of cars. They should stay out of airplanes. Basically, any form of cross-country travel, they should just stay away from at this point. And the next car accident that would befall the Kennedy family would actually take place on May 4th, 2006, when Patrick J. Kennedy, son of Ted Kennedy, would crash his car into a barricade in Washington, D.C. while he was intoxicated. When police arrived on the scene of the crash, Patrick Kennedy revealed he was struggling with a litany of addictions in regards to prescription drugs, and he was actually sentenced to 1 year of probation and had to pay a $350 fine. Now, couple this together with a few more health problems the Kennedy families have had throughout, its large and vast expansion into American pop culture, society, and politics, you can see why many people think that the Kennedy family could be cursed outright. And let's talk about that before we discuss theories. Now, in doing my research, it seems more than apparent that the family had tremendous weight on their shoulders pretty much from the beginning of time, and that got passed down from generation to generation. The idea that your family has this long line of succession and political ambitions, that you were kind of always in the spotlight in some way, shape, or form, that's just not healthy. And I think in some cases you can see that with members of the Kennedy family who just couldn't handle the pressure and the stress of being a part of something like this, or the feeling of, having to get this laundry list of education and then go into politics and try to consistently make your parents and grandparents proud by living up to the Kennedy family legacy. Again, I could be completely taking this out of context, but this is to me, this is what I'm really getting out of this, is that from the get-go, you have this immense pressure on yourselves to live up to expectations, live up to the hype, so to speak. And as we've discussed with certain members of the Kennedy family, some people could do it, and then it seems to me is that other people could not do it. And the toll that it took on their mental and physical health was tremendous and immense. But that, of course, is my own opinions being shared. But let's get into possible theories about the Kennedy curse. Now, our first theory is that this is a real curse, perhaps from some type of unknown force. Now, this theory hinges on the idea that the curse is real, in some capacity, and whatever is causing it is something that we don't fully understand, and that this curse bears some relation to other types of curses we have seen over history. Of course, not every person with the last name Kennedy has encountered some type of terrible fate, but how frequently these incidents occur makes it worth noting that the Kennedys are seemingly dying while doing activities that they would normally engage in, or they are just dying under freak accidents. Maybe we just don't fully understand why the curse happens. Again, I mentioned maybe the botched lobotomy in 1941 on Rosemary Kennedy, maybe that triggered these chains of events that are still happening to this day. Of course, we have not seen a Kennedy pass away since 2020, but that seems like that could change at any moment. There was obviously time periods in history where it went a decade plus, with there being no deaths in the Kennedy family. But this unknown force and curses in general, curses seem so kind of vague and so surrounded in urban legend, it's almost very tricky to find a specific moment in history where the curse could have been set in, or who could have set the curse on them. Of course, we see that very often with Native American stories of settlers coming in and being cursed. We even see that the curse of King Tut, for example, that is a very popular one. Anybody who has handled the casket of King Tut seems to be cursed. So the idea that this is a real curse from an unknown force seems like a very fun one to explore, but again, it's very hard to narrow down and figure out the exact point of when this unknown force could have been set in. Now, our second theory is that this is a real curse, but rather not from an unknown force, but rather coincidentally from Joe Sr. kind of forcing his family to succeed. Now, an author by the name of Les Williams said in his book, The Kennedy Curse Shattered, that the curse isn't some type of evil omen that exists in the way that we might think of a traditional curse of, but rather say that the curse stems from the patriarch of the whole family and his overbearing ways. William states in his book, and I quote, "Joe Kennedy raised his children to believe that they were better than anyone else and that they had to win every time and at any cost. His obsessive, driving ambition would influence the decisions his children made and the way they lived their lives, and this controlling, overbearing approach would have disastrous consequences for the family over the years." Now, Williams here makes a very compelling case as to whether or not this is the catalyst for a curse or not. It's kind of impossible to tell whether or not that Joe Sr.'s overbearing ways kind of started the curse and kind of started this domino effect, if you will, of members of the Kennedy family dying under unexplainable circumstances. Now, our last theory is the given that this is not real. This seems to be all coincidence, and every Kennedy death are just coincidence, and that the Kennedys are just a family that would often overstress themselves with work, this constant pursuit of perfection, and of course we have assassination, which I don't know if you want to loop assassination with coincidence, but obviously assassinations from outside parties, and obviously it seems to me that the Kennedys, because of this added stress, this added pressure, there was regular use of narcotics as well to help handle some of these mental issues. And all of those things are common themes, of course, that I've discussed throughout this episode and throughout many members of the Kennedy family. So to me, I kind of like that, but I also like the idea that Joe Sr. was, again, just this overbearing person that under any circumstances, he had to have his children succeed. He had to be the winner. He had to be this guy that was just, the alpha, the top of the pyramid, so to speak. So to me, it would make sense that once his children, Joe Sr.'s children, grew up, that they just pass that down from generation to generation. I feel like family values persist throughout generations, even though they take some type of different forms every once in a while. Those same practices usually have a tendency to trickle down and have this trickle-down effect to other members of the family. But in my personal opinion, I think that this is a combination between some of these just being sheer coincidence and some of these being, Joe Sr. obviously being overbearing. I don't think that we can attribute assassinations to the idea that there's this curse. I think the most interesting part of the curse is the idea that, again, the Kennedys' shocking, I shouldn't say inconvenience when it comes to airplanes. Again, I've mentioned it before. I think the Kennedys should just stay the hell out of airplanes. But again, it seems just so fluke coincidences, one-off coincidences that they could happen to anybody, and I think they do happen to everybody, but just because it's the Kennedy family, I think they're amplified to a degree. And I think because of the constant stress and pressure the Kennedy family faces basically on a day in, day out basis, because their last name's Kennedy, this turns a lot of them to go towards prescription drugs, narcotics, to help handle their stress and help handle their mental state, when that is not the right way to go about it whatsoever. So in my personal opinion, I think that some of these are coincidences, and I think that some of these are, again, fluke accidents, and that these are, again, it's a combination of a plethora of different things between, again, coincidental accidents, obviously assassinations. Again, I'm not going to count those as being part of the curse because, again, you're high up figures in politics. I shouldn't say that that's a risk with the thing, but it's like we've seen political assassinations before. I mean, heck, we've seen 2 in the news in the past 4 months. So, again, they happen. I don't think that contributes to this grander conspiracy of a curse. I think that this is the idea that the Kennedy family has been in the spotlight for so long. A lot of people have been able to handle the stress differently. Some people not so much. Some people have seen the trauma of their family members pass away on live television. So you have a combination of a lot of different things occurring here. The idea that it is this curse caused by this unknown force, I just have a very tough time believing. But with that being said, that is going to conclude this week's episode on the Kennedy curse. Again, episode 50. I hope you all enjoyed it. But with that being said, I'm going to do my obligatory plugs that I do at the end of every episode. If you are listening to this on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It greatly helps me out with my content. It helps me get it out to a heck of a lot more people, expand my reach, and I greatly appreciate it. I am also on Instagram at Unblurring the Unknown. You can check me out there where I post custom cover art from each episode each week. I'm also over on TikTok. I admit I'm not as active on TikTok as I should be. Also at Unblurring the Unknown, where I do 1-minute breakdowns of all of the episodes that I do. But with that being said, that's going to conclude this week's episode, episode 50, the big one, over the Kennedy curse. And I hope you all enjoyed it. And I will see you all on the next one.